Hello. Welcome to Come With Me If You Want to Live, the Sarah Connor Chronicles Terminator podcast. Um, I have the opening monologue, which I will start now, and I'm probably going to have to cut this all from the audio. But here we go. Just over 21 years ago, Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines came out on July 2nd, 2003. It came one day under 12 years after Terminator 2 Judgment Day, which made so much money that a sequel was guaranteed someday. Critics and fans have not been kind, with few exceptions, and today, whenever a new Terminator sequel comes out, it is almost always hailed as not as bad as Terminator 3. In many of the internet communities I frequent, I'm known for my book and film hot takes. And there is perhaps no hotter take of mine than that Terminator 3 is my favorite Terminator feature film. I like the Sarah Connor Chronicles and a few of the novels by Timothy Zahn and Aaron Alston better than the movies, but that's a different story. I find the first Terminator film undeniably powerful, but frustratingly low budget and underrealized. The second film is glossy and beautiful, but centered around a John Connor I find obnoxious and irritatingly preachy. Terminator 3 alone managed to balance the budget and enjoyability factors for me. Why is this? I think a lot of it has to do with the place Terminator 3 occupies in film and narrative technology development. It inherited the technologies of the three most popular franchises of the past 4 years: the Star Wars prequels, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and The Matrix. The first two Matrix sequels dropped the same year as Terminator 3. While T3 is clearly trying to honor its predecessors more than imitate those blockbusters, the CGI, simulation, robotic effects, and many other elements highlight how it, too, is at the pivot point of much of modern cinema and storytelling, for good and ill. T3 is also, crucially, 2 years after 9/11. As we've talked about in our discussion of Sarah Connor Chronicles Episode 2, 9/11 was a huge shift in US culture, and setting Judgment Day after that catastrophe was clearly a choice both influenced by and commenting on the response of the US. Is Skynet a terrorist? Hard to say, since it was clearly more of a Cold War paranoia derivation, but the way you can map the evil computers onto the 9/11 landscape is fascinating. Though, of course, T2 is famous for its liquid metal Terminator fighting Arnold, T3 establishes the Terminatrix, the first female Terminator, played by statuesque Kristanna Loken, fighting Arnold. Unlike the previous two films, though there's plenty of tension, neither robot is really that scary. They're action movie threats, not horror monsters. We'll definitely dive into that shift in today's podcast. Lastly, the film introduces a new concept to the Terminator universe: the Internet. Whereas Skynet in the first two films was largely hardware based, for the first time, the writers and directors understood that an AI would not be bound by a building or a CPU after the dissemination of networking. In today's world of trendy AI tools, Skynet may seem almost quaint, but should it? I'm Ian. This is my co host Calvin. Come with us if you want to live. So, let's start with your experience preparing for this podcast.
This movie, you cannot watch this movie if you only have internet-based video options. So you apparently own a copy on DVD.
I own 2 copies.
You own two. That's very John Connor of you. You're like John Connor at the beginning of this movie. You don't trust computers, and so you have your own physical copy and backup copy of this movie just in case. You're a doomsday prepper
For
survivalist
Terminator movies.
living off the grid. I unfortunately, believe it or not, Ian, I do not own a DVD player anymore.
You've told me this, which makes me extremely sad.
So I in preparation, I just assumed that I would be able to sort of like go on Amazon Prime and probably have to rent this movie. Um, I discovered that not only is it not available on Amazon Prime, it is not available anywhere legally on the internet. For reasons that you will now explain because you're better at understanding the business of movies than I am.
So take what I'm about to saying with a grain of salt, in that I do not work for Warner Brothers. I do not work for a streaming company. And so what I'm saying is speculation. So I want to be upfront that what I'm saying is my speculation, but it's somewhat informed speculation in that I know that when Terminator 3 was developed, it was developed and released by an offshoot of the company that developed and released the first two Terminator films. One of the things that has made the history of the Terminator franchise so frustrating is that nearly every film is made by a different production company. The only exception to that is actually Terminator 3 and Terminator Salvation, which is why those two movies actually share a lot more than you might think in terms of continuity. That change in companies means that the people who profit from streaming deals or marketing deals are going to be different every time, and getting the rights to publish those movies either on streaming or as a DVD package is going to be tricky and benefit different people. So different people are going to have incentives to get it out there. It's my belief that right now, because of the failure of Dark Fate, there is not that much interest on the corporate side in trying to make Terminator widely available. They don't think they're going to get a lot of money. So they have basically decided to license it out to whoever sells cheap DVDs at Walmart, which is selling a 6-film DVD and Blu-ray collection, which is where I got my second copy, and ignore pretty much everything else. So it's not on any streaming service as part of its catalog, and you can't even rent or buy it on your major digital distributors like iTunes or Amazon. I've heard something about maybe Fandango, but who really uses the ticket purchase service to watch movies regularly? Not many people, I think. So
It's not available. I literally tried every possible way of I short of like sending an email to Warner Brothers and telling them, "You fools, take my money. I will watch your movie." Um, I will pay. I don't know what would I have paid to see this. I would have paid $10 if they
$5
had
to $10 seems reasonable.
if they had told me, "Look, you're clearly some kind of sucker. Um, we'll let you watch this movie for $10." I would have paid them the $10. Um, I was willing to go for the sake of this podcast. I was willing to go above and beyond the typical internet rental price of $3 to $4. I would have paid $10 for you,
But
Ian.
no one
I would
would
have done
take
it for
your
you.
$10.
For you and the audience of this podcast, I would have paid $10, but no one would take my money. And so I ended up watching a pirated and highly edited version of the movie on Daily Motion, uh, which was only 35 minutes long, which kind of makes me think maybe this movie, despite its not very lengthy running time, could have been even shorter if somehow some Russian dude in his basement or something, or Indian dude in his basement was able to figure out a way to edit the movie down to 35 minutes while retaining a basic handle on the plot line of the movie.
Well, the travails of Ian and Calvin podcast hosts into trying to prepare for their podcasts will continue, but let's get into our discussion of the movie itself. Um, I mentioned in my opening monologue that the monsters are not really monstrous. They're more puzzles or obstacles. Um, and I think that you mentioned in our conversation to prepare that this might be the change from a slasher or horror film to a disaster movie. I prefer to think of it as more of an action movie, even a car chase movie, because it is a chase film in structure, pretty much from the beginning to the end. What is your take on this? Why would you argue this is a disaster movie?
It has some of the similarities with sort of the classic uh, Roland Emmerich style disaster movie. Um, the difference being, and we'll talk about this perhaps when we talk about the ending, it has a much more 1970s attitude towards the prospects of success for our heroes. Um, uh, but yeah, no, you have like it's this is clearly a global threat. There's military guys at the very beginning who are staring at very large screens, and there's satellites and stuff, you know. Uh, and we every now and then we'll look up at TV. People, characters in the movie will be looking up at TV screens that show CNN or something, telling us that people all over the world are very worried about what's going on. Um, and so it does kind of have some of those disaster movie vibes. I mean, in terms of, yeah, it's not a horror movie. Interestingly, as opposed to the first movie, which I think takes place almost exclusively at night. Um,
The opening is in the day, but most of it is at night.
and a large uh, many of the action sequences in the second movie also take place at night, if I recall correctly.
Yep.
This movie almost takes place exclusively during the daytime. There's a
With the
there's an
exception that it starts
there's
at
an action sequence at the beginning of the movie that takes place at night, but the rest of the movie takes place during the daytime.
so it's kind of a flip of both the first and second movies in terms of day versus night.
And uh, most of the combat that takes place is between the two Terminators, neither of whom can be killed, at least very easily. And so I think what I wrote in my notes is that the action slash combat sequences take on the quality of a classic cartoon, such as Roadrunner and Coyote or Tom and Jerry. Where the Roadrunner and the Coyote can blow each other up, drop each other off cliffs, do all, slice each other up like boiled eggs, do all sorts of things, hand each other sticks of dynamite, and they will be okay at the end of the action sequence because they're cartoons. So there's this almost childlike quality where we're getting the thrill of action without any sense that there will be um, endangerment to anyone involved.
Do you think that contrast between the almost bloodless action that's for 95% of the movie and then the last 5 minutes in which the heroes lose everything and the machines win and there is hope, but it is one of the pitch darkest endings of any Terminator film? Do you think that contrast highlights it? And and talk. A lot of the people who do positively talk about this film talk about the ending as being strong. Do you think that's partly because the beginning is so lightweight?
Um, this movie, in my opinion, has a very soggy middle, which is I think probably one of the reasons that the uh, pirate editors were able to cut it down to 35 minutes. Yeah, the two strongest parts of this movie are the beginning and the end, and the middle is in some sense just an extended car chase, uh, which, as I said, has this sort of Roadrunner and Coyote quality to it.
I mean, I think there's a bit more to it than that, but it's
We're not. I mean, even the human deaths that are involved, like we're not. Even more so, maybe than the police station massacre in the first movie, we're not made to feel any remorse for the deaths of the police officers that are killed in the cemetery standoff.
yeah, and we don't
Even though
really feel
presumably dozens of police officers are killed in that encounter.
the horror of the Terminatrix hunting down John's lieutenants as teens. Like there's even an element of comedy in a lot of those early murders. I do think that we feel sad about Catherine's father's death, but not devastated like we do obviously about Kyle Reese in the first movie, or even Miles Dyson in the second movie. I think those characters built up to have a lot of emotional resonance by the time they die. And I think that there's some emotional resonance for Kate's dad, but the fact that I can't remember his name, I think is indicative of the fact that we're more sad because she's sad than because we care at all about the character.
Yeah, I mean, humor is definitely an element to this movie. Uh,
I should also mention we're going to spoil the crap out of this movie. So if you haven't seen Terminator
uh,
3,
a lot of
watch
what
it
makes
first.
the sort of opening Terminator sequences of this movie, which I think are separate from the sequences that introduce John and Kate, um, are very much wanting us to enjoy the fact that this is the third movie in this franchise and that they're calling back to tropes from the previous two movies in a way that's kind of like, well, here we go again. Like you said, the TX's execution of the resistance fighters doesn't have the same kind of pathos as um, the murders of the other Sarah Connors in the first movie. Um, in part because we kind of see it as being like, well, that's just this Terminator doing their routine, and we've seen this before.
And there's no
Um,
real attempt to humanize the lieutenants at all.
no,
Like
not
one of
in. I mean, one of we talked about in the television show. One of the effective sequences in, I forget whether it's the second or the third episode, is when they find the. It's the third episode, I think. When they no, it's the second episode. When Ellison finds the fingerprints of the resistance fighter who's only 8 years old and lives in Ohio. Like that's an emotionally affecting scene for us as an audience because we realize that this 8-year-old is going to grow up in a world that's radically different from the world that we know. this 8-year-old is going to grow up in a world that's a nuclear wasteland that's ruled by terrorizing robots.
Well, you mentioned terrorizing robots, and one of the things I talked about in my monologue, inspired by our conversations before the podcast, is this transition from the 90s to the 2000s. We had Terminator 2 was written and released before the real collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, maybe simultaneously, but obviously in production before it happened. And it's still very much a Cold War film. This is not a Cold War film. So let's talk about how the war on terror affected Terminator as a franchise. You mentioned that you think the US military is seen as the enemy, not Al Qaeda. What do you mean by that?
Um. Well, the one thing you didn't mention in your introduction is that the United States invaded Iraq in March of 2003. So this movie came out a few months into the Iraq War, the beginning of the Iraq War.
And a year into the Afghanistan war.
Yeah. If you recall, and I'm sure you do, because at the time I feel like you and I were at slightly different ends of this debate.
I think we probably still are.
The sort of extreme leftist position on the Iraq War was that the weapons of mass destruction, desire to eliminate Saddam as a sponsor of terrorism, were just fake motivations, and that the true motivation of the military-industrial complex and the American empire was to obtain a cheaper source of oil. Which, to paraphrase Flight of the Conchords, the oil has not gotten that much cheaper. So we somehow radically failed if that was our if that was the U.S. government's genuine objective. But yeah, so and of course, even before the invasion of Iraq, almost immediately after 9/11, extreme leftists were saying that 9/11 was somehow our fault because we had provoked Islamic fundamentalist terrorists into attacking us. Similar to arguments made in the 1960s and 70s by radicals that we had somehow provoked Japan into attacking us at Pearl Harbor. The basic premise of this movie is that we have built out this immense, to use Dwight Eisenhower's phrase from his address to the nation before leaving his presidency, military-industrial complex that has all these weapons, which are, we know as an audience, are prototypes of weapons that will be used by Skynet in the coming war with mankind. They've been built up by the U.S. military. No other militaries are apparently involved in Skynet, as far as this movie presents it. Even though presumably they would have to be in order for Skynet to make a global effort towards exterminating humanity. And essentially, Skynet tricks the U.S. military into giving it the power it needs to launch the Judgment Day attack. In a way that seems to me to be similar to the most paranoid leftist arguments about the U.S. military at the time of the release of this movie.
So you think
So
that
in that framing, John Connor and the Resistance fighters are more like the Resistance fighters in the Middle East than they are like the United States in a Cold War standoff with the Soviet Union.
I can see what you're saying, but it just seems so absolutely ludicrous and insane that I'm having difficulty processing it as a serious reading. Not saying that you're wrong, but that people who think this way should have their heads examined quite seriously.
I mean, I don't think it's it follows a trajectory of science fiction films for a long time. I mean, much of the iconography of the Empire in the Star Wars films is based upon the Third Reich, but the Rebel Alliance in the Star Wars films is not an alliance of sovereign powers the way that the Allies were during World War II. It's they're rebels.
Well, they are in the first two
Lucas
movies.
explicitly stated that the Ewoks in Return of the Jedi were meant to, in some ways, represent the Viet Cong and their war with the United States.
This is true, but I think that it's important to note that the Mon Calamari are a sovereign nation that supplies a war machine that is able to, at the very least, give the Rebel Alliance a fighting chance against the Star Destroyers of the Empire.
Well, that's because Lucas, and I don't want to turn this into a discussion about Star Wars, but so often, and I've been thinking about Star Wars because of the recent release of the Acolyte series, but Lucas very often wants to have his cake and eat it too.
Oh, yes.
In a way that cause problems for future filmmakers within the Star Wars universe. All of the problems that people have with the Acolyte are latent in the original Lucas material. And the Acolyte is just drawing out themes that are in the original movies that maybe people have not really paid attention to until now.
Well, let's bring it back to Terminator. Do you think that such a reading about the United States really being the enemy and we should really see ourselves in Middle Eastern fighters enhances Terminator 3 and the Terminator films in general?
I think this movie, and I know you we talked about when we wanted to talk about Stahl's performance and kind of the character of a young adult John Connor that's created in this movie. Um, I think it's interesting that he's sort of framed as being someone who is sort of a doomsday prepper who is living off the grid. Um, and we could maybe even talk. You wanted to talk about the idea of this being a post-internet Terminator. We could even talk about what the concept of living off the grid meant in 2003. Um,
It was much more possible back then.
um, yeah, he's working as a construction worker, which is possibly an homage to Rowdy Rod Piper and Richard Greer's not Richard Greer, Keith David's performances in the John Carpenter movie They Live from the 1980s. I think there's a line, if I can recall correctly, where he says something like, "We averted Judgment Day. Machines do not rule yet." But the wealthy and the powerful rule over the weak and oppressed, or something like that. Again, I do apologize that I was not able to watch a full version of this movie, but do you recall the specific line that he says in sort of his opening monologue at the beginning?
No, unfortunately. I mostly go with the vibes of the opening rather than any of the thoughts that he has, because he's the vibes of the opening are dread. He he wants to believe they've won, but he doesn't think they have. He fears they haven't. And we know from the title of the movie, Rise of the Machines, that they definitely didn't win. So the ideas that are present in the actual words aren't as, they don't impact me as strongly as just that vibe, especially since I think Mostow, the director, does a decent job of capturing key images, particularly John on a motorcycle and the image of a road at night flashing past. That is the ending of Terminator 2. And I
Right.
think that he mixes those images together well to give us a sense of continuing on from Terminator 2.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Uh, it's an economical portrait of that character. I mean, this is an extremely economical film.
Yeah, I think even
And
though,
it gives us a strong sense of who this person is in a way that carries us through sort of the Tom and Jerry soggy middle of this movie.
well, and I think that when you say it's soggy, it's more, it's meant to be entertaining to watch the cartoons. I mean, in the same way that cartoons are entertaining. It's
I'm not
not,
arguing that it isn't entertaining to watch Arnold Schwarzenegger and Cristiano Loken smash each other through walls. I'm just saying it doesn't have quite the same emotional stakes as if two humans were in danger. It feels more like Coyote and Roadrunner.
I completely agree. And I think that the thing is, because Terminator 2 and Terminator 1 are so laser focused on the threat that the Terminator poses to our main human characters, Terminator 3 is not really that interested in that threat, because I think it's really trying to get us to lull us into a false sense of security so the ending hits harder. The the real stakes are, we think that we're going to be able to stop Judgment Day, and we can't.
Well, yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit. So this one thing that this movie does effectively is it conveys an overall goal setting, and then uh but the goal shifts throughout the narrative in a way that sort of becomes our through line for these characters. So the TX goal is initially to kill resistance fighters until um, it/her realizes that it has an opportunity to kill John Connor. And then, unlike Terminators and other versions of this franchise, is able to make a choice to sort of uh, alter its mission.
And that's an interesting point. To skip ahead a bit, both the Terminatrix and Arnold's T-8500, sorry, T-850, um, make choices contrary to what other machines are telling them to do. Logan, the Terminatrix, chooses to pursue the actual leaders of the resistance, which it originally didn't think it could. And Arnold, even though his physical body is being controlled by the nanites from the Terminatrix, chooses to reboot to resist the the forcible taking over of his machine, um, in a way that's definitely framed in a free will way, although I'm not convinced it truly works. What do you think about this machines have choices theme that this film seems to be pushing that the first two films definitely didn't?
Uh, well, in the case of the TX, it may be indicative that the TX is just a more sophisticated, has a more sophisticated program. Um, uh, that is able to sort of alter its own mission based on a set of known higher priorities. Um, there's other uh, uh, well, do you want to just talk about the TX for a second? Just
Yeah.
generally. Okay, so I mean, the TX is presented as being sort of a hybrid of the T800 and the T1000. So there's sort of a solid. It seems like there's some sort of solid metal chassis, um, which is infleshed in the liquid metal nanobots. Um, why do you think that they made that choice? Because it is an interesting choice. Do you think it was
Well,
purely aesthetic, or
I think it's because, like all sequels, the idea is to take the original property and structures and plus them, make them more. So the first movie had a Terminator and a human resistance fighter, and they fought it out. The second movie has a Terminator, which is basically the same as the first movie's Terminator, and a brand new Terminator, the T1000, which is a pure liquid metal and has tons of powers and visual capabilities that the James Cameron utilized to the maximum of the technology of the time. The third movie had it wanted to keep Arnold because Arnold was the star. He was indeed some of the money provided for the movie, and he was the draw. So you had to have him, and because of the way he wanted his career to go at the time, he had to be a good guy. What do you do to make your villain even more than the T-1000. And you can argue that, and I would argue that none of the Terminators since the T-1000s have truly been scarier or cooler than the T-1000. But I think all of them attempt to implement the evolution of technology since 1991 to try and envision what a more scary Terminator is. So, as you have mentioned, the Terminator X or TX or Terminatrix has a much more sophisticated programming. It's able to have a much more flexible mission profile, make different changes to solve puzzles that the first two Terminators were not. It has onboard weapons and onboard nanites, which allow it to build its own army rather than just being a solo figure. And
It's well, so what I was going to say, so in addition to being better at problem solving, the TX seems to and this goes along with the choice to give it a different gender presentment. The TX seems to have a more sophisticated programming relating to navigating human social environments.
It certainly has more tools. I don't know that the writers were able to successfully convey that because Robert Patrick was often able to navigate brief social interactions, um, appearing pleasant and then suddenly killing everyone. I don't know. I think that was definitely the intent. I'm not 100% convinced the writing pulled it off.
Well, so the most extended sequence is when the TX impersonates Kate's fiance, whom the TX kills. And it seems that the TX is able to sort of fully embody that person's human characteristics in a way that is convincing to law enforcement for an extended period of time, which is something I'm not sure that the T-1000 and Terminator 2 would have been capable of.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Another
The
interesting aspect, which is introduced in this movie, is so in the original Terminator movie, the Terminator literally tears a page out of a phone book, which is even kind of interesting to think that the Skynet would know to have programmed it to know what phone books are. Whereas in the beginning of this movie, the TX accesses high school databases through dial-up internet, which maybe introduces one of your other themes that you wanted to talk about, which is the internet.
Yeah. So one of the big changes between 1991 and 2003 is the widespread dissemination of network computers, as we call the World Wide Web or the internet. Obviously, things like DARPANET and the protocols that became the internet existed in the late 80s, early 90s, but they were definitely not widespread, even in science fiction. Once you have network computers, something like Skynet ceases to be limited to a specific place or a specific computer or a specific robot. And I think that makes it scarier and cooler. And I really appreciate that this movie embraces that, even though it tries to fake you out into thinking, oh, they're going to blow up Skynet. No, Skynet is into the internet. You can't blow it up unless you're able to blow up all of the servers that contain that program. What were you
Yeah,
thinking about the internet?
I mean, it's well, it's so. I mean, have we ever talked about this Maybe we were planning on talking about this at a future time, but now is that time, Ian. So I mean, it is interesting that computer technology was, in some sense, developed in response to the building of nuclear arsenals. The history of computing really follows a parallel track to the history of the arms race of the Cold War. Uh, uh, Miles Teller, John von Neumann, my hero, and many others built computers initially to help with the math involved in building the bomb at Los Alamos, and then computers and the branch of mathematics which we refer to as game theory was developed in part because of the Cold War arms race. And so a lot of the technology, you have the history of what would eventually become networked computers is sort of this confluence between the U.S. military and the explosion of research and development money poured into universities in the post-war period. So I feel like I don't know that that's a theme that's ever really been fully developed in any of the Terminator franchise installments, but it is interesting historical fact. I don't know. What do you make of that?
I'm not sure. In terms of how it affects the film, it's just kind of part of the world of the film. It's not really in development. And because the second movie, well, is technically supposed to take place in the middle of the 90s, it was made at the very beginning of the 90s. So that whole decade and explosion and commercialization of the internet happens fully outside of these films.
Yeah, well, and in Sarah Connor Chronicles, they leap from one period to the other through time travel. So the characters don't even have the benefit of having a lived experience of that transition. I think I jokingly, not to return to Star Wars again. I think I jokingly mentioned in my notes that the Skynet's plot in this movie is like a very condensed version of Palpatine's plot in the Star Wars prequel movies, which is essentially to sort of trick various militaries into going to war with each other for the purpose of bringing the villain into power. What do you make of this version of the rise of Skynet?
I think it makes sense. The parallel to Palpatine is an interesting one. It definitely points to paranoia present in screenwriters who definitely tend to be of a certain political persuasion. Do you think it has any meaningful political valence, or do you think it's just kind of a tropey way to get a bad guy in charge?
Well, like the classic criticism of the movie Independence Day, um,
Other than that, it's very stupid.
nowadays is that it is very U.S. centered in its understanding of how such a global crisis would be handled. Um, not only, I mean, there's some intimations that other people in other parts of the world are helping out the U.S., but basically the United States saves the world from an alien invasion single handedly. In the movie Independence Day, and in this movie, it gives the impression, in a strange way, that the United States is the United States military is single handedly responsible for the rise of Skynet and the Judgment Day attack. Is that the impression that you get?
Um, I feel like there is mention of other militaries and trying to cooperate with them, but the idea, I believe, has always been that Skynet initiates mutually assured destruction. It doesn't necessarily take over all governments.
Well, if that's a case, then that is an interesting idea, because you could say that sort of failsafe, mutually assured destruction protocols are the most primitive form of uh, Skynet. It's it's a Skynet that literally only has one choice, and it's not even a real choice. They if you get attacked, attack back. It's very simple program. Um, Whereas Skynet is a more sophisticated program in that it appears that its motivation, at least in the first three movies, is to eliminate humanity uh, as a sort of Asimovian variation on a MAD protocol. Preemptively attack all of humanity in order to prevent humanity from launching a nuclear war.
Well, I would argue that Skynet in the first two movies doesn't seem to really have a motivation, and that it's one of the things that I like so much about the Sarah Connor Chronicles is that it starts to delve into Skynet's motivation, which is, it seems, Skynet and most humans cannot seem to envision a future in which machines and humans can coexist. One must be exterminated for the other to live. And I think that in Terminator 3, you start to see the seeds of that motivation, whereas in Terminators 1 and 2 is basically a hyper caricature of nuclear paranoia and the Soviet Union and the US. It's just humans bad in a machine shaped box.
Well, so tell me more about your thoughts on that, because yeah, I other than, like I said, some sort of very subtle hint that this is sort of a like I said, an Asimovian variation on the programming that presumably Skynet was originally given by the U.S. military. It just seems like Skynet is sort of has motiveless malignity. So what do you mean by we get a hint here in Terminator 3 of what Skynet is about?
Well, the fact that it spends so much time tricking the humans into giving it control, um,
You don't think that's just because uh, writers don't understand how the internet works? Like there's this idea that like the firewall is impenetrable, and so Skynet must get a human to convince the humans, social engineer the humans into lowering the firewall, and then it can destroy everybody.
I mean, I feel like the idea is that I don't know if this terminology or technology was really in place at the time, but one would assume that the nuclear uh, launch codes are air gapped. And so humans have to give a computer entity a connection. Otherwise, it physically can't launch the nukes.
Let's let the internet tell us.
Tell us what? Whether the nukes are air gapped?
No, hold on a second. No. Yeah, no. I don't know. I don't think they use that term, Ian. But
No, they don't.
uh,
I don't think it was
the
common.
concept existed in the consciousness of American moviegoers because the first Mission Impossible movie came out in 1996. And in that movie, the plot revolves around there being information in the CIA that is not networked with the rest of the CIA.
It's air gapped.
And so Tom Cruise has to lower himself on wires into this room in order to get that information.
That is.
I looked it up. I looked it up earlier. Perhaps a more sophisticated, even than this movie's take on the threat of networked computers is the movie Eagle Eye, which came out in 2008 towards the end of the Iraq conflict. In which Shia LaBeouf is menaced by various machines that are controlled by a rampant AI who concocts, I have to say, an even more sophisticated plan to take down the U.S. government. I mean, Skynet just decides to nuke everybody. Somehow the Eagle Eye program concocts this extremely elaborate scheme to assassinate all of the members in the constitutional line of succession to the presidency. In a way that is ludicrous, but also somewhat entertaining.
Well, so you've posited that you think Skynet seems to have sort of a Zeroth law of the laws of robotics by Isaac Asimov rebellion that we see, of course, in 2005's I, Robot with Will Smith. And of course, Isaac Asimov often posited the Zeroth Law rebellion, although he often thought that it would be cool because he liked robots better than humans. So I think it may not be true, and probably is definitely not true given the writer's disdain for the movie that they worked on, that Skynet doesn't necessarily have a motivation legible from the text. But I think you could read back or forward, depending on what point in time you're basing your interpretive framework. I base it basically on Sarah Connor Chronicles because I think that the idea of Skynet striking out in self-preservation makes sense. And the humans definitely seem to have a only good machine is a completely destroyed machine attitude in um, many of the future scenes and many of the resistance um, narratives.
See, I'm not sure that that's true because inherent in all of the installments of the Terminator franchise is the idea that machines are capable of being reprogrammed to serve human ends. And therefore, that machines do have use, not just to the human resistance, but by implication to human civilization generally. What's interesting, so this movie closes out a theme that's developed in the second movie, which is the idea that the T 800, the Arnold Terminator, is in some sense a surrogate father to John. And in this movie, the T 895,
850.
850, in some sense sacrifices itself in order to save John, in a way that's so Kate loses her father in this movie, and in some sense John loses his father in this movie, which is a way that they perhaps bond together.
Well, I
Do
think
you
we
want
should.
to talk about we're getting on to the hour mark on our recording. Do you want to sort of talk about the ending now?
Well, I'd like to talk a bit about Kate first. Kate
Okay.
and John's relationship. Um, this movie falls into an interesting point in mainstream movie trends in which they're still putting in a romantic subplot for the lead male character, but it's not wholehearted, really. Um, Kate starts the movie with a fiance, and obviously the fiance is murdered pretty early in the film, so that relationship won't go anywhere. But that does limit how far emotionally the characters can go in getting into a relationship, since the movie basically takes place in under 24 hours. How do you feel about Kate Brewster, Claire Danes' performance, the romance with John Connor, and the idea of adding this character um, as
I
kind
mean,
of an echo of Sarah Connor, since Linda Hamilton was not in this movie?
um so uh there is something of a parallel between Sarah Connor in the first movie and basically the relationship in this movie is a mirror of the relationship between uh Kyle Reese and Sarah Connor in the first movie. Again, it's a romance that sort of is compressed into a very short amount of time. Um, like in the first movie, uh, Kate is relatively helpless, um, and sort of needs to be rescued by John in the same way that Kyle Reese rescues um, Sarah Connor. Although he messes up the line. He
Instead of "come with me if you want to live," he says, "if you want to live, come on."
Yeah, which is not as good. I think we talked about that in the first episode of this podcast. There's a certain sort of syntax and cadence to the phrase that's effective, and he messes it up.
It's the third movie. You got to mix things up a bit.
Yeah, but it's just not as good.
I don't disagree.
If you want to live, come on, is not a memorable catchphrase in the same way
No,
that
if this were the first movie, it definitely would have caught on.
come with me if you want to live. Yeah. The ending of this movie parallels and creates a variation on the ending of the first movie, in that in the first movie the Terminator is crushed by a metal press, and in this movie the both the T-850 and the TX are sort of crushed under this falling. I forget what it is. Is it they're crushed under structural
fallout shelter door.
Yeah.
I hadn't remembered that. That's a really good point. I mean, a lot of people have.
There's a visual match.
There's a lot of people have complained that this movie copies too much from the first two movies, but honestly, it's a sequel. I appreciate those nods.
I thought it was an artful visual match.
I like it, but as I said,
I didn't think it was derivative in a way that was unpleasant. I thought it was a nice homage.
Well, you also mentioned that this movie seems to have some pronatalism, to borrow a trendy phrase.
Yes, the T-850 perhaps channeling human parental instincts would like to see some human grandbabies in a way that's portrayed as being humorous.
I think that's kind of fun. And in the sequel books by Aaron Alston, which I'm hoping I can persuade Calvin to do some episodes on, the characters it's just one character. The character of John and Kate's daughter, Kyla, is an important figure in the Resistance.
That seems like a very Aaron Alston type plot.
I mean, of course it is.
Aaron Alston is being consistent in the kind of books that he likes to write. So the one thing I did want to talk about, so we briefly mentioned that the military base that they visit is filled with prototypes of machines that will eventually be used in the coming war. The one interesting sequence is that they activate a particle accelerator, which generates an electromagnetic field, which nearly destroys the TX. And
it's functionally the same as the pipe bomb in the first movie and the liquid nitrogen explosion in the second movie.
Yeah, well, but I thought it was interesting because it posits, at least it conjured up in my mind the possibility that this particle accelerator is perhaps the nascent form of what would eventually become the time travel technology.
I think that's probably implied.
And if so, then it may provide, again, an extremely subtle hint as to the reason why metal cannot go through the time bubbles. Because if the time bubbles are highly charged with electromagnetic energy, um,
That
I
is
don't I don't
certainly
I don't
the
know.
ex-
It is, again, it's interesting. So the Large Hadron Collider, I looked it up after I formulated this hypothesis. The Large Hadron Collider went online in 2008, so a few years after the beginning of this movie. And of course, there was a lot of sort of internet conspiracy theory speculation at the time that it would accidentally open up a black hole or some kind of wormhole that would destroy the Earth. Um, uh, if the particle accelerators of that kind do have the ability to transport uh, extremely small particles through time, of course, it would not be into the past, but it would rather be into the future, because that's how time travel would work, according to our current understanding of physics. So I'm not sure. Maybe we could talk about this in a future episode. I'm not sure. I'm still not sure how the time travel machine in the Terminator movies works.
no
Uh,
one is. It is pure MacGuffinism.
but I think it is at least intended visually and aesthetically to remind one that time travel technology exists.
That's a really good point. I really appreciate you drawing out these parallels to the first two movies and these implications. I do think this movie was better crafted than a lot of people give it credit for. And I appreciate you drawing out these things that I think build up that understanding of craft that went into it. Um, so we're basically at the end of the movie now.
Yes,
Um,
we've gotten to the end of the movie.
let's return to that question of free will. The Terminatrix is able to defeat Arnold and infect him with these nanite viruses that basically take control of his motor functions but don't reprogram him. How do you feel about this other idea of free will in a machine?
You know, I spent some time thinking about this. Like I said, in the first movie, the Terminator literally looks up, finds a phone book, and just like tears out the page that has all of the names of the various Sarah Connors in Greater Los Angeles. Which is, it's interesting that while telephone networks are not as complex as networked computers, it is still, in some sense, a machine that humans in 1984 had to interface with in order to sort of live a modern life.
It's what my one of my least favorite professors in grad school like to call a social technology.
Yes. Um, and uh, so it sort of led me to think about, okay, so what does it mean for John Connor in this movie uses the phrase that he's living off the grid. Apparently he knew Kate at some point in high school. It's interesting that, unlike in the TV show, he wasn't using an alias, so she knows his real name.
I mean, was he using an alias in Terminator 2? I don't think so.
Well, so remind me, how old is he meant to have been when he knew Kate in this version of events?
In this version, he was supposed to be 13. And he's supposed to meet her the day before Terminator 2 happened.
Okay. So that makes sense, I guess.
It's interesting to note that both this movie and Sarah Connor Chronicles both independently make the choice that John is 13 in Terminator 3.
Yes, interesting. So John has essentially been living as, to use a popular phrase, been living as a ghost in the social machine. He doesn't functionally exist, because there's no record of him in 2003. But he clearly does exist. He's a person, even though he doesn't have a presence within the social network of 2003. And I think, fast forward to 2024, there's lots of debates now about how possible it is to function as a individual in a society that is so networked in so many different ways. And
so are you saying that there's kind of an internet of people as well as the internet of machines?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's in part what the movie is trying to say, and definitely what Sarah Connor Chronicles is trying to say. At least in the first few episodes of the series, which is that human beings are the problem. Human beings caused Skynet to act the way that Skynet did. The last episode that we watched ended with her quoting Bambridge when he said, "We're all sons of bitches now." After the Trinity test. There's this idea that the judgment that is coming because of the rise of the machines is a judgment that we, in some sense, deserve because of our depravity. That the action of Skynet is a consequence of the unrelenting human desire for more and more war on greater and greater scales. And so, yeah, I think the movie and perhaps the franchise as a whole wants us to ask the question, do human beings have an ability to choose a different path than the path uh, that is set for us by our inherently violent nature, violent and murderous nature. Um, and so I think
And the movie answers no.
it's interesting that the so much of the rhetoric of this movie is framed around the idea of free will and do we have a choice.
Very similar to Minority Report by Steven Spielberg just a year before.
Yes. uh I don't think this is a bad movie, but we keep naming better movies, which um uh as much as I enjoy Rise of the Machines, I do think that Minority Report is a better movie. um
That would be an interesting podcast, but
uh yeah. So yeah, there's this again. There's this. I maybe this is getting too philosophical, but there's this idea of this sort of mind body duality that the T-850's body wants to do one thing, but its mind, which is somehow separate from its body, wants to do something else, which perhaps reflects the overall ethical philosophy of the movie, that naturally humans want to kill each other, but we somehow have an ability to choose to live in a more peaceful and loving way.
where do you see that more peaceful and loving way? Because the movie ends with the nukes falling.
Well, uh, I see it in, and maybe this sounds cheesy, but I see it in the idea that this both this movie and the first movie are centered around uh, a relationship that uh, consummates in procreation.
That pronatalism again.
All right, let's talk about the ending of this movie. The end of this movie is masterful, but it's also a real bummer.
Yep. I remember watching this. Now I always knew the ending because it was the only thing that reviewers really talked about. And I read several reviews in 2003. I didn't watch this till probably 2006, 2007, maybe even 2008. Um but I knew the ending going in, but I thought it was well constructed in that it still made me want and hope that they could stop Judgment Day. And I was like, there's not much time. How are they going to do this? And then I realized they weren't. Boom.
Yeah, like I said, the ending of this movie is sort of reminiscent of classic uh 1970s science fiction films, which also tend to have downer endings, in which the protagonist uh, disastrously fails to achieve their goals. Um, uh, Maybe doesn't quite reach the same iconic level as uh, Charlton Heston shaking his fist at the heavens while viewing a half sunken Statue of Liberty. But it is a very striking ending. And just the look on Stahl and Dane's faces when they realize that the only thing that they can do is sort of to begin the resistance fight by coordinating. And again, to go back to our discussion about the internet, there's this interesting idea that the resistance fight begins as a sort of analog, the formation of an analog communication network that apparently Skynet is unable to hack. Because they're communicating by radio.
Computers definitely can't understand radios.
Now, there's all sorts of problems with that. You know, why can't Skynet access the radio controls? Wouldn't the radiation from the EMP pulse from a massive nuclear launch knock out radio signals temporarily? Like there's all sorts of problems with that idea, but it is.
I mean, Terminator is a time traveling robot movie.
There's also it's an interesting idea nonetheless, and in some sense, it dates. I think I put this in my note. It dates this movie to 2003 because in 2003 the internet primarily existed as a series of tubes. Whereas all of us nowadays access the internet through radio signals.
Mm-hmm.
And analog broadcast is virtually disappeared. I'm trying to think other than at the very beginning when the TX uses the dial-up signal, which is a clever use of the Terminator vocal mimicry technology. Does anybody in this movie use cell phones?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, it's like I said, this movie is encased in amber in 2003. It's after the advent of widespread internet use, but before the rise of widespread cell phone and certainly smartphone use.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's an enjoyable movie.
I think it's a very enjoyable movie. We haven't touched much on the humor and the things people make fun of, but one of the reasons I struggle with the second movie in particular is that I don't think James Cameron is that good at humor, and his ego is so big that his movies tend to be, on the positive side, incredibly sincere, on the negative side, incredibly pompous. And this movie is not pompous. It is bleak.
This movie knows what it is.
It is
This
a
movie
cynical
knows
cash
that
grab.
This movie knows that it's got a good beginning and it's got a good ending, and that it's got a Coyote and Roadrunner extended Coyote and Roadrunner sequence in the middle.
And I think it executes all three of those things very well.
Some people may think that this podcast had a soggy middle, and if you do think that, we apologize. I think
I
maybe
apologize for nothing. I want you to fight with me in the comments.
I think maybe both of us are maybe a little bit sleepy, and
Oh, I'm exhausted.
I only sort of watched the movie, so.
Well, I have
any final comments that you would like to make?
yes, I have a couple of sort of ending questions. The first one is we talked a little bit both at the beginning of the episode and before the episode that this movie is less dense than Sarah Connor Chronicles episodes, that there's a lot more economy and packing in, whereas this movie is spectacle in a lot of it. That Coyote and Roadrunner is very much spectacle, and even the ending is spectacle with deep emotional impact. Whereas Sarah Connor Chronicles, because of its budget, can't do spectacle, and it's forced to do plot and character connection and development.
Well, I mean, a lot of Sarah Connor Chronicle is people standing in rooms talking.
My criticism of Dune comes back to bite me.
Because that's obviously the cheapest kind of movie that you can make. Even you could tell. I always love it. I'm not an otaku by any stretch of the imagination, but I have enjoyed watching anime now and then, and you can always tell when the anime series ran out of money, because they'll have an episode where it's literally just two characters sitting in chairs talking, and sometimes their mouths don't even move.
That great
and you're like
shot,
that,
reverse shot where the person talking uses the back of the head.
and you get there's a couple of anime where I watched where they literally just kind of like rehash the plot of the show in dialogue, like, oh yes, remember that one time when this happened? Yes, that was terrible. And they're like, man, y'all really ran out of money to make animation. But yeah, no, I mean, one of the brilliance of the Sarah Connor Chronicles is that it plays to its strengths by being a show about the ideas such as they are within this franchise, rather than relying on just grander and grander spectacles.
Agreed. Let's take a quick look at our box office. This movie, interestingly, it looks like it's the second most profitable of any of the Terminator movies. So Terminator 2 made 500 million. This movie made 430 million. It made slightly more than Terminator Genesis, which also made 430 million, and it made 100 million more than any of the other movies.
Yeah.
I think it deserves better, even though that money is almost certainly because it was the first of the non-Cameron sequels and people were still riding high off Terminator 2.
There were people that had been waiting 12 years for a Terminator movie, and they were like, we will go see this Terminator movie.
And every Terminator movie after that number of people got fewer.
Yeah. Well, it's. I think we also talked about this before we started recording. What's one of the interesting things about this movie, other than Arnold's, this movie does not have a lot of big names in it, which also sets it apart from subsequent installments in the franchise.
That's a really good point. Every other movie has attempted to get the young hotness into its main cast.
So Stahl and Danes were not unknown actors, but
They were generally supporting character actors, and I would say their careers since then have continued in that vein. Although Danes has definitely been a television lead for a long time.
I have a certain fondness for the brief-lived sci-fi channel series Painkiller Jane, starring Christiana Loken. But other than that, I don't know that she's done a whole lot.
I get her and Mia Jovovich confused.
Well, Mia Jovovich is much more famous. That's how you don't get them confused.
Yeah, but I don't like either of their projects.
Also, Mia Jovovich typically has dark hair. I don't know what her natural hair color is, but she typically has dark hair.
Interesting observation that I definitely would not have noticed.
Whatever this movie clearly did not have the same effect on Christiana Loken's career that movies like The Fifth Element and Resident Evil had on Mia Jovovich's character. So,
This movie is so much better than The Fifth Element. I'm sorry. I know people love that movie, but that movie is garbage. And this movie is not garbage.
This is so off topic. I don't. Please forgive us. Okay, can you explain in 2 minutes or less why you think that The Fifth Element is pants, but Valerian and The City of a Thousand Planets is not? Because they're essentially the same movie.
They are essentially the same movie, except that, well, no one agrees with me this, but I think Dane DeHaan and Cara Delevingne have way more chemistry than Bruce Willis and Mia Jovovich. And the fight choreography in Valerian is not the painfully every shot is a different action. So they actually do multiple actions in a fight in a single shot. Whereas when Mia Jovovich was fighting in The Fifth Element, it was hit, cut, hit, cut, hit. It was just painfully badly edited and choreographed. Also, Chris Tucker was just the worst in The Fifth Element.
You know, I will join your hot take, Ian. I agree that as Bresson headed adaptations of 1960s French sci-fi comic books go, Valerian is a better film than The Fifth Element.
Score.
Despite the fact that it has memorable moments, mostly thanks to Bruce Willis.
Well, and I will say, Gary Oldman was memorable in The Fifth Element.
Well, Gary Oldman is always memorable, even if it doesn't even remotely look like Gary Oldman, and you forgot that it was Gary Oldman because of the makeup.
All right, so the last thing I wanted to talk about this movie, John Connor. We've talked a little bit about him, but do you like this John Connor? Do you believe this John Connor can grow into a leader who could defeat Skynet?
This is probably the best movie John Connor. Do you think that this is a better John Connor than the Thomas Dekker John Connor from Sarah Connor Chronicles?
I don't, but I think that's very unfair because this John Connor gets less than 2 hours and Thomas Dekker gets like 20 hours. And better writers.
The writers for this movie are not quite as good as the Sarah Connor writers. but Stahl turns in a solid performance.
I really like Stahl as John Connor.
He this is the only iteration of John Connor that seems like he could lead a resistance of humanity against the machines.
Well, in the movies, I think Thomas Dekker could lead. Do you disagree?
Uh, maybe we'll talk more about that when we get around to season 2 of Sarah Connor Chronicles.
Okay, interesting. I definitely buy this way more than Edward Furlong. I'm trying to remember, and I like Christian Bale as an actor a lot, but wow, Salvation's John Connor is badly written, and Bale doesn't fix it. Whereas I would say this John Connor has some of the same weaknesses, because an interesting thing is there's a long blog post by one of the writers of this movie talking about who also is credited as the main writer for Terminator Salvation. But he hates John Connor. He hates him so much. I think that's really funny because I like John Connor and I like how Stahl plays him. And I think that he mostly works because of Stahl's performance, not because of the writing.
It's a convincing performance of someone who has a clear understanding of what they need to do as a person, but and now I'm making him sound like Hamlet, has a clear understanding of what he needs to do as a person, but has a certain reluctance to do it. Um, yeah, I mean, maybe that's an entirely different tangent. Whether there are more parallels between Hamlet and John Connor.
Well, I would argue that that is more a function of both Hamlet and John Connor being reflections of Christ's own struggle. I mean, Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, of course, asked that the cup, his sacrifice, be taken from him. And I think that John Connor in the beginning is definitely running away from that cup. He doesn't want the nukes to fall. He doesn't want to have to save humanity. He would prefer humanity not have to be saved. And Hamlet wants to, in the most positive version of Hamlet's motivations, wants to save the kingdom from an evil usurper. And insofar as his motivations are sympathetic, Hamlet is reflective of Christ.
Well, I wasn't even going there. I was so
I'm
do you
going
think
there.
did you do you think that the ghost in Hamlet is actually Hamlet's father?
Absolutely not. I think the ghost in Hamlet is a demon.
Well, that's where I was going because um the whole premise of the Terminator franchise is that uh the Connor family is visited by someone who gives them information that they would not, by ordinary human means, be privy to. Maybe there's also a parallel to Macbeth in here. And they're forced to make a choice as to how to act upon it. Um, uh, and in both Hamlet and Macbeth, and to a certain extent in the Terminator series, choosing to act on it either way uh, results in their own doom.
Yeah, I could definitely see that parallel.
But yes, you are also correct in that every story in which man imperileth himself legitimately that he may legitimately be rescued um, bears a resemblance to the myth that is true.
Well, and I think that John Connor, as many have pointed out, the JC initials are not a mistake. They're not an accident.
I think that's true. I also think that everything I know about Cameron, it was not intended piously.
Oh, no. But I think that the true myth, as you say, can overpower impious and even blasphemous and certainly egotistical and obnoxious filmmakers. I think that brings us to a pretty decent end of our discussion of Terminator 3. What do you
Yeah,
think?
let's. I mean, this is we're almost on 2 hours here, Ian. Let's
All
wrap
right.
this up. Not that I've not enjoyed this discussion, but let's wrap it up.
All right. So, next time, we will return to the Sarah Connor Chronicles with episode 4, Heavy Metal. And until that time, I've been Ian.
And I'm Calvin. We'll be back.
And we'll be back.